Hello and welcome to Coaching Overwatch. I'm Coach Sexy and today's topic is productive VOD review structure. But first, a little bit of context. The advice in this video will be primarily aimed at tier 2 teams and below, teams with low resources, low time, don't have a team house, etc. That being said, the principles in this video can still be applied to teams in better circumstances. So we'll be looking at guidelines for the two main categories of VOD review, which are bird's eye and point of view from your own scrims. There are other ways to utilize VODs, but we won't be discussing those today. All right. Number 1, length. Try to keep VOD review sessions under 30 minutes. Most people can't endure being taught for very long. If you force your team to go too long, their attention will dwindle, and that makes that time unproductive. And worse, you risk them consciously or unconsciously resenting VOD review sessions, which is dangerous. Now, to be fair, if you're extremely engaging and entertaining, you can extend someone's attention span. Also, if you can create an atmosphere of learning where it doesn't feel like learning, then you can really extend someone's attention span. But these topics are out of the scope of this video, so let's move on. Be concise. This is extremely important. Coaches and analysts tend to be quite wordy and over-explain sometimes. I've found that writing down my thoughts helps improve and shorten my verbal communication. And I'm not just talking about note-taking, which you should always be doing. I mean fully writing out my thoughts about a problem and possible solutions. Then over time, you'll start noticing a transformation in your speech. All right, moving on. Enlist some of your more willful players to analyze VODs with you before going to the whole group. If you're a lone coach and short on time, do not underestimate this tactic. Bouncing ideas off of one or two players in a preparation session is extremely useful. It's intimate, it's real, it's fast, it's engaging, and it's very honest. It's like a strike team. Then you can do the proper VOD review with the whole team. Otherwise, if you just go into the VOD review dry and try to get everyone to participate, the discussion tends to get very unbalanced. Number 2, frequency. This ties into the first guideline. If you have short VOD reviews, you should try to do them as frequently as possible. Before scrims, after scrims, in between scrims if the gap is wide enough. And if you can split up your scrim days with tons of breaks and quick VOD review sessions, that's typically going to be better than having dedicated scrim days and dedicated VOD review days. Because with dedicated days, your players might look at VOD reviews as this massive monolith that's slow and boring. And yeah, your mileage may vary here. Some players like the more academic approach to learning, but that's not for everyone. Also, this may sound silly, but please do lots of VOD review. If you're scrimming 90% of the time and VOD reviewing 10% of the time, that's not really sustainable if you expect to improve quickly. Look for something closer to 80-20 or 70-30. Number 3, conceptualize your feedback. We're going to be here a while, so strap in. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's look at some example feedback. Let's say our hypothetical coach gave this feedback at the following timestamps of a VOD review. Blinking now was bad. You should have not chased here. You should have saved your ultimate here. And while this feedback is most likely valid, we have to ask ourselves, how well is the player learning? So let's see if we can improve this by expanding the feedback with an explanation. Now I'm going to read the first example to Tracer, and then feel free to pause the video if you want to read the other examples. Blinking now was bad because you went in before the call to dive. You spooked the Zen back, who then got healed, so our Winston jumps into a highly dangerous location where he's out of position and dies. Now, these examples show how the coach goes into way more detail and explains the feedback by lining it with context. There's reasoning and meaning behind it, but let's try to go a bit deeper. We're going to expand this feedback with conceptualization. Blinking now was bad because yada yada, blah blah blah. Let's move on to this part that says, timing is critical for a successful dive because dive, like many other tactics and compositions, have smaller windows of opportunities. Another example would be shield bash and shatter combo. This is unlike other strategies like quad tank where timing is still relevant but not nearly as critical to have in mind when executing. With all of this expanded feedback, the coach is explaining the thought process until reaching a conceptual conclusion. In these examples, the concepts were timing, risk versus reward, and then in the last one, making the distinction between two different concepts, teamfight awareness and macro awareness. So putting thoughts into a framework or structure really helps the learning process. Otherwise, if we look back at the Tracer blinking feedback, the feedback is alone, it's isolated, it's off just floating out and away in space like a balloon. You need to connect your feedback to something. You need to ground it, attach it, so the balloon doesn't fly away. That's where conceptualization really helps. And some feedback requires a solid understanding of multiple concepts. And if the player doesn't have a good grasp of all of them, or perhaps a misprioritization of the importance of those multiple concepts, then that problem will just keep recurring until their understanding improves. This is absolutely critical because, as we saw in the tracer blinking feedback, the coach mentions how the importance of timing varies depending on the situation. This is probably the most important part of this video because at the higher levels of Overwatch, coaching players becomes less about understanding concepts and more about how to assign value to those concepts and building a web that shows how concepts are related and connected. And to make it harder, those values fluctuate like crazy as circumstances change because Overwatch is just so fast-paced. So it's important that you have a coherent value system that your players can internalize. This will allow them to play off of feeling and instinct without having to calculate, because calculating for humans is quite slow. Alright, I want to tangent off and do one more example of conceptualization to drive the point home. Let's say you wanted to give a piece of perfectly good and valid feedback to a player like, you need to look at the kill feed more because you keep using ultimates when the fight isn't winnable. Okay, that's good advice, but let's make it stick more with the concept. Gaze control is an important concept to understand and master. On the screen, you can look at many things like the center of your screen, the kill feed, the game mode information like time, cart distance, etc., cooldowns, ammo, health, the scoreboard, the 3D environment. So it's important that you understand how to prioritize each area of the screen depending on what's happening in game. Now let's relate this concept with another one we've talked about, which is fight climaxes. When you think a fight is peaking, force your eyes to look at the kill feed every few seconds. This will help guide your decisions. It will be hard at first to manually control your gaze, but it will feel natural with practice. This explanation will almost certainly stick better. It's specific and it's enclosed around the concept of gaze control, and bonus points for connecting it to another concept, fight climaxes. Connecting concepts is critical for players so they know how to prioritize them in real time. Another bonus of conceptualization is that future feedback can then reference older concepts and it can be used as a shorthand in conversation, which is extremely useful because instead of having to say things like, hey, are you watching the kill feed better lately? You can just say, hey, how's your gaze control lately? Which has much more meaning and context behind it, making it a more powerful way to communicate. This also boosts communication during matches by being more accurate and productive. And players already like speaking in shorthand concepts during matches, so give them lots of concepts to play with. That way, they don't default to analysis like, we need to play more aggressive. They can instead be more specific with something like, we're not timing our plays with each other. You're basically empowering your players with meaningful language. And as a side note, don't overcomplicate or over-conceptualize things. Sometimes it's perfectly okay to just say, hey, you're reloading too often, or you're jumping too much. Over time, you'll find that balance as a coach. Okay, tangent over. Let's look at one last way to upgrade our feedback, which is to start off your feedback as questions. Typically, this is better because you'll be less likely to reach the wrong conceptual conclusion. If you look at the previous examples, the coach was making a ton of assumptions and didn't give the player a chance to exchange dialogue. Let the player guide you, because they may point out that the root problem is actually somewhere else. They're the ones in their own head after all. Maybe in the D.Va example, she chased and got demeched because she thought she had way more health than she actually did, thinking the play was safe. Well, then maybe the problem wasn't misunderstanding risk versus reward, but actually gaze control. Or maybe it was something else entirely. As the coach, you need to investigate and find that problem. Then you can formulate a solution and back it up with a concept. But like anything else, don't overdo asking questions. Starting every piece of feedback with a question can easily get annoying. And of course, practice the right tone when asking questions. Alright, number 4, prioritize your feedback. Once you're finishing up your VOD review, you probably went through anywhere between 1 and 10 different topics of feedback. Now your goal is to just pick 1 or 2 things for that player to focus on. If it's a team VOD review, those 1 or 2 things will most likely be team-oriented goals. And ask your players for their opinion on what they think is most important, and give your take on it as well. After engaging in a dialogue, it's up to you to make that final call. The reason you only pick 1 or 2 things is because trying new tasks requires a ton of mental processing power, so to speak. If we look at our gaze control example, you better believe the player's mind is working overtime to integrate that new pathway in their brain. So having someone work on 10 other things at the same time will just deadlock everything, so the improvement rate just plummets. Number 5, actionable change. Once you've prioritized an issue, it's time to discuss with the player how they plan on fixing it. If it's a team-oriented problem, discuss everyone's role within it. Lots of problems are just a matter of being mindful of that problem, but some things require a bit of a battle plan as to how to improve it, so work on that with the player. Also, have them type out their actionable change in a doc or spreadsheet, or write it down if they're old school. This is critical because articulating thoughts is what drives the process of learning. And make sure the players put it in their own words. Otherwise, they're just regurgitating what you or someone else says. You want your players to problem solve and think for themselves, and writing things in their own words will develop those skills much more rapidly. Lastly, this adds a layer of ownership for the players, propelling them to be more accountable and proactive about their own learning and development. This sense of responsibility will accelerate their growth. Number 6, post-review maintenance. After you had a successful VOD review, the work doesn't stop there. You want to reinforce your feedback whenever you get the chance, like in future VOD reviews and during scrims. And actually, on the topic of scrims, some coaches like to be more hands-on during scrims and some more hands-off. Hands-on means you get to make more of an impact on your players, and hands-off means you allow your players to practice problem-solving more. And while it's okay to lean either way, you will have to speak up sometimes, so let's talk about watching scrims. First off, watching a scrim in real time can be extraordinarily difficult if you've never done it before. So to help with that, view the rounds through the lens of the prioritized goals you gave your team and players. This makes the task much more digestible. And to make things even better, this will then accelerate your players' improvements towards their own goals because you'll be pointing out things that are already at the center of their minds. And it's all still fresh because you're in between maps. If you don't do this, watching a scrim in real time where you can't pause or rewind can be daunting and frustrating. You'll be aimless and you'll just sort of wander. So keep these goals in your mind as you watch and evaluate. And on a logistical note, keep your document of prioritized goals with you as you watch. Okay, Q&A. How do you balance one-on-one VOD reviews and team VOD reviews? That entirely depends on your team. If you're just one coach on a team, well then, good luck because you're going to need it. Just try your best and listen to what your players want. Some weeks will call for more one-on-one reviews, and some weeks will call for more team reviews. How do you pick what to review? Start with the most severe errors you wrote down and work backwards from there. And ask players where they felt lost about what to do. It's not always the case that the games where you lose or the fights where you lose are the ones you want to look at, but those are usually the easiest to spot errors in, so you'll typically look at those first. Alright, TLDR. Keep the length of VOD reviews short, do VOD reviews as frequently as possible, conceptualize your feedback, prioritize your feedback, have your players describe the actionable changes they will make to improve themselves, and last, reference the feedback and concepts from previous sessions during future VOD reviews and future scrims. Alright, I'll put a transcription of this video below. Until next time.